George Washington Vanderbilt too did not set out to build a house. He set out to construct a world he could govern. When the idea that became the Biltmore Estate took hold in the late 1880s, Vanderbilt was already one of the wealthiest men in America by inheritance alone, the grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt, beneficiary of a fortune built on railroads, shipping, and industrial leverage. Yet unlike the tycoons who chased public dominance through corporations and politics, Vanderbilt pursued something quieter and more absolute: control without a crown. A private kingdom, sealed behind gates, where wealth did not circulate but settled, solidified, and endured. Stand in the valley outside Asheville, North Carolina, as Vanderbilt once did, surveying thousands of acres of forested land, and the logic becomes clearer. This was not simply a retreat from New York society, it was a calculated withdrawal from unpredictability. In an era marked by labor unrest, financial panics, and the violent volatility of the Gilded Age economy, Vanderbilt envisioned the Biltmore Estate as insulation. Land was stability. Scale was security. Self-sufficiency was power. By the time construction formally began in 1889, Vanderbilt had already acquired more than 125,000 acres, an area larger than many American cities at the time, deliberately positioned far from industrial centers, unions, and urban scrutiny. The Biltmore Estate was conceived as a total system. Forests were managed, not admired. Farms were engineered to supply meat, dairy, and produce. Water was controlled from source to tap. Electricity, still a novelty in American homes, was generated on site. This was the machinery of luxury, not indulgence for its own sake but dominance through infrastructure. A house that became a machine. Every dependency eliminated was another layer of autonomy added. Every acre absorbed reduced exposure to the outside world's failures. Vanderbilt's ambition was shaped by education as much as inheritance. He had traveled extensively through Europe, studying aristocratic estates that functioned as economic engines as well as symbols of lineage. But America had no feudal tradition, no inherited titles, no castles passed down over centuries. The Biltmore Estate was an attempt to manufacture that permanence in a country defined by mobility and collapse. It was a statement that some fortunes were meant to outlast markets, elections, and generations. That belief carried a cost, even before the first stone was set. By the early 1890s, Vanderbilt was spending millions annually on land acquisition, planning, and preparation, at a time when the average American worker earned less than $500 per year. There was no practical return on this investment, no profit motive in the conventional sense. The value lay in control, in creating a closed circuit of wealth where capital flowed inward and rarely escaped. Step past the showpiece intentions and you see the underlying fear, that money alone was not enough to guarantee safety, relevance, or legacy. The obsession deepened as national instability grew. The Panic of 1893 wiped out banks, destroyed businesses, and exposed the fragility of even immense fortunes. Rather than slowing Vanderbilt's plans, the crisis reinforced them. The Biltmore Estate became a hedge against chaos, a place designed to operate regardless of economic weather. A self-contained world, paid for in advance, insulated by scale and distance. Behind the facade of leisure and refinement was an urgent response to a country that no longer felt predictable, even to its elites. Yet the vision carried a contradiction. Absolute control requires constant expenditure. Land must be maintained. Systems must be staffed. Power must be fed. What appears permanent is often the most fragile. Vanderbilt's decision to build the Biltmore Estate was not just an expression of confidence. It was a wager that wealth could be frozen in physical form, immune to time. That wager would shape every decision that followed, binding the family's future to a single, enormous idea. The Biltmore Estate rises not as a residence but as a declaration carved in limestone. When architect Richard Morris Hunt finalized the design in the early 1890s, he did not look to American precedent. He looked to the chateaus of France's Loire Valley, monuments built for kings and ministers who ruled by inheritance and enforced hierarchy through stone. The result was a house scaled beyond domestic necessity: 250 rooms, 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, and more than 4 acres under roof. This was architecture as authority. Power without a crown. Step through the main entrance and the intent becomes unmistakable. The central hall ascends 7 stories, framed by Indiana limestone walls and a ceiling inspired by François Manson's Renaissance designs. Every surface signals permanence. Hand-carved woodwork. Imported marble. Custom ironwork forged not for efficiency but for spectacle. None of this was ornamental excess alone. It was a visual language meant to establish dominance the moment a visitor crossed the threshold. The house speaks before its owner ever appears. Hunt designed the Biltmore Estate as a controlled experience. Public rooms flow in a deliberate sequence, growing grander with each step, guiding guests toward awe and submission. The banquet hall stretches 70 feet long with a ceiling rising over 30 feet, large enough to host hundreds, yet used only a few weeks each year. The library holds more than 10,000 volumes, a private archive assembled to project intellectual authority as much as cultural taste. Even leisure was formalized. The indoor swimming pool, bowling alley, and winter garden were not comforts. They were proofs of surplus, visible evidence that resources were abundant enough to be spent on pleasure alone. Behind the facade, another architecture exists. Step past the showpiece rooms and the corridors narrow. Ceilings lower. Materials change. This is the machinery of luxury, the unseen network that made the spectacle possible. Servant staircases run parallel to grand halls, allowing staff to move invisibly. Bell systems connected nearly every room, summoning labor on demand. Kitchens were separated by floors and walls to keep heat, noise, and people out of sight. At full operation, the Biltmore Estate required hundreds of workers. Cooks, maids, valets, gardeners, electricians, carpenters, and stable hands, each occupying a precisely defined role within an architectural hierarchy. The design encoded inequality into stone. Public spaces were vast and ceremonial. Working spaces were efficient and compressed. Servants' bedrooms were small, shared, and tucked into upper floors and basement levels. The contrast was not accidental. It was structural. French Renaissance architecture had always been about visibility and control, about who was seen and who remained hidden. Hunt translated that logic perfectly for an American context, creating a house that displayed wealth while concealing the labor that sustained it. The materials themselves tell part of the story. Limestone quarried in Indiana. Brick fired on-site by temporary kilns. Timber harvested from Vanderbilt's own forests. Nothing was spared because restraint would have undermined the message. The Biltmore Estate had to appear timeless, immune to decay, as though it had always belonged to the landscape. But this illusion required constant intervention. Stone must be cleaned. Roofs repaired. Mechanical systems updated. Grandeur is not static. It demands maintenance, and maintenance demands people. What they don't show is how fragile this excess truly was. The house was completed in 1895, at a time when most Americans lived without indoor plumbing or electricity. The gap between spectacle and reality was enormous, and architecture became the medium through which that gap was normalized. Visitors saw beauty. They did not see the schedules, the wages, the physical toll of maintaining a house that functioned more like a palace than a home. They did not see the bill accumulating quietly behind the walls. By the time the first stones were laid at the Biltmore Estate in 1889, thousands of workers had already become invisible instruments of George Vanderbilt's vision. Men and women, many recent immigrants from Italy, Germany, and Ireland, were recruited for wages that reflected the era's economic hierarchy, $1.50 to $3 per day for grueling 12 to 14-hour shifts, often in conditions that would be considered unsafe even by the standards of the day. The project required expertise in carpentry, masonry, ironwork, and plumbing, but the demand for speed and scale often overrode any concern for safety. Scaffolding rose hundreds of feet above the valleys of Asheville, wooden planks trembling under the weight of stone blocks hewn on site. Accidents were common. Limbs crushed, bones broken, exhaustion leading to collapse in the heat of summer or the freezing cold of winter. Many injuries went unrecorded. Many deaths went unremarked. The laborers' sacrifices were etched into the very walls they erected, invisible to the opulent rooms above. Step past the front gates and you might not see the workforce at all. Behind the limestone facades and the formal gardens, a hidden network of temporary housing and work camps had been erected to accommodate artisans and laborers. Wooden shacks, often cramped and unsanitary, became home for those who lived on site, their presence essential to maintain the pace Vanderbilt demanded. Food was basic, medical care minimal. Yet the human toll was unavoidable. By the peak of construction in the early 1890s, more than 1,000 workers were employed daily, each dependent on rigid hierarchies of task, supervision, and reporting. The division of labor was stark. Master craftsmen received recognition and relative comfort, while the majority, masons' assistants, laborers, stable hands, remained faceless contributors to a vision that would outlast them. The cost of this labor extended beyond physical suffering. Socially, the Biltmore Estate mirrored the entrenched inequalities of the Gilded Age. Vanderbilt's household maintained a clear hierarchy that both reflected and enforced the broader class divides. Step past the showpiece rooms, and the invisible hands keeping the house functional reveal themselves in corridors, service staircases, and hidden kitchens. Hundreds of domestic staff members, maids, cooks, valets, laundresses, and stable workers, lived under strict schedules, their days dictated by the needs of the family and the machinery of luxury. Work began before sunrise and stretched late into the night, a continuous loop that ensured the visible grandeur above remained immaculate and uninterrupted. The architecture itself codified their invisibility, high ceilings and sweeping staircases reserved for the family and guests, narrow, steep stairs and low-lit hallways reserved for service. Power was structural, embedded into the very design of the mansion. Financially, Vanderbilt's ambitions demanded constant input. Every dollar spent on imported materials, bespoke furnishings, and elaborate gardens required someone to extract, transport, and install it. Timber came from surrounding forests, stone from distant quarries, marble shipped from Italy. Each material carried the hidden cost of labor, both human and environmental. By the time the house neared completion in 1895, the total construction expenditure had exceeded $5 million, a staggering sum, equivalent to over $180 million today. Yet for those who labored, this wealth remained a mirage. Their lives were structured around maintenance of someone else's legacy, their achievements recognized only through the perfection of a building whose presence eclipsed them entirely. The human cost extended to the emotional and psychological as well. Many workers were isolated from families, living in temporary camps and enduring harsh winters in the North Carolina mountains. Seasonal illness and injury were constant companions, while the constant hierarchy reinforced a sense of powerlessness. Even skilled craftsmen could be disciplined, fined, or dismissed without recourse. Step into the maintenance corridors today and you sense the echoes of those unseen hands. The mortar that cracked under fatigue, the woodwork carved by calloused fingers, the floors polished under exhaustion. The mansion's perfection depended upon their endurance and submission, a hidden ledger of effort paid in sweat and sacrifice. The labor force's invisibility continued after construction. The house required ongoing upkeep. Stables maintained dozens of horses, kitchens fed hundreds of meals per day, and gardens demanded year-round attention. The divide between those who inherited power and those who sustained it remained stark. Vanderbilt's family experienced comfort and security. The staff maintained a rigid schedule, their presence necessary but perpetually unacknowledged. Architecture was more than design, it was social engineering, codifying inequality in stone, wood, and metal. Every hallway, every hidden service stair, reinforced a social hierarchy as rigid as the limestone walls themselves. By the turn of the century, the Biltmore Estate was no longer merely a project. It had become a vast, living organism demanding constant attention, labor, and most of all, money. George Washington Vanderbilt too had poured millions into construction. Estimates suggest the final cost exceeded $5 million by 1895, a staggering sum equivalent to over $175 million today, but the true expense was only beginning. Every detail of the house, every inch of imported marble, every carved balustrade and custom-fitted timber, carried with it a continuing burden: staff salaries, utilities, food supplies, repairs, and the operation of the estate's farms and workshops. The machinery of luxury is costly, and Vanderbilt's vision, magnificent as it was, proved unsustainable when measured against reality. Step past the grand halls and formal gardens, and the financial machinery reveals its strain. Hundreds of staff were employed year-round. 175 servants tended the house alone, with cooks, maids, valets, and stable hands rotating through shifts to maintain a level of service befitting the Vanderbilts' wealth. On the grounds, foresters, carpenters, blacksmiths, and engineers labored to manage forests, water systems, and mechanized operations. Even with Vanderbilt's fortune, the wages alone became a pressure point, a steady drain compounded by taxes, estate upkeep, and the unpredictability of markets outside the estate's gates. Luxury, in its extreme form, demanded a ledger that never balanced. The 1893 financial panic had already shaken the foundations of American wealth. Railroads collapsed, banks failed, and fortunes evaporated overnight. While the Vanderbilts were insulated compared to most, the Biltmore Estate was uniquely exposed. Unlike a liquid investment or a diversified portfolio, the mansion represented capital locked into immovable assets. Every renovation, repair, or seasonal preparation required cash flow. When economic turbulence arrived, the estate became a liability, a gilded weight pressing down on an otherwise secure fortune. By the early 1900s, what had begun as an expression of absolute control revealed itself as a precarious enterprise, dependent on continued income and vigilant management. The hidden cost was compounded by scale. Biltmore's forests were meticulously managed, with thousands of acres cleared, replanted, and logged according to a schedule designed to maintain ecological productivity and revenue from timber. Farms required constant oversight. Dairies produced milk and cheese for the family and staff, gardens yielded vegetables for consumption and decoration, and livestock needed care year-round. The estate was designed to be largely self-sufficient, but self-sufficiency does not eliminate cost. It shifts it into labor, logistics, and long-term maintenance. Machinery, from water pumps to electric generators, required constant monitoring. When systems failed, replacements were expensive and downtime compromised the illusion of flawless operation. Even George Vanderbilt's personal expenditures were formidable. Art acquisitions, furniture, books, and imported materials were not one-time purchases. Each item demanded insurance, protection, and upkeep. European tapestries had to be cleaned carefully to avoid decay. Marble floors and grand staircases were constantly polished. The estate's wine cellar alone contained thousands of bottles, stored in climate-controlled conditions, each bottle representing both status and ongoing expense. The Biltmore Estate's opulence was a live accounting exercise, a continual cycle in which the grandeur of the house and the comfort of its occupants relied entirely on sustained wealth and meticulous management. By the 1910s, the strain was evident even to outsiders. The estate generated some revenue through forestry and agriculture, but these were insufficient to cover the full cost of operation. The Vanderbilt family began exploring options to offset the burden, leasing parts of the land, opening sections of the house to private tours, and experimenting with commercial agricultural initiatives. Even then, the scale of the property and the level of service expected meant that any miscalculation could, and did, result in financial pressure. Power without a crown, it seemed, came with hidden obligations that money alone could not erase. By the mid-20th century, the Biltmore Estate had begun a transformation almost as ambitious as its construction. After decades of private occupancy, the house and its surrounding 125,000 acres faced a choice between obscurity and survival. The immense scale that had once symbolized unassailable power had become a financial and operational liability. Step through the wrought iron gates today, and the impression is one of seamless grandeur, manicured gardens, and a narrative of timeless elegance. But behind the polished tours and curated photographs lies a history rewritten for public consumption, a carefully managed story that obscures the struggles, labor, and ongoing costs that sustain this architectural colossus. Tourism became the estate's lifeline. Beginning in the 1930s and 1940s, the Vanderbilts opened select areas to visitors, charging admission to generate revenue to maintain the house and preserve the grounds. The library, the banquet hall, and the grand staircase became objects of admiration, while the intricate machinery of upkeep, the hidden stairways, the bell systems, the basement workshops, the extensive staff quarters, remained off-limits, invisible to the paying public. Stand in the main hall and you can imagine the original purpose: a machine for both daily life and spectacle. The tours, however, present only one layer, glossing over the immense human effort required to keep that machinery running for more than a century. Preservation became both mission and marketing. Every restoration, from stone facades to interior paneling, was a delicate negotiation between authenticity and aesthetic appeal. Historical photographs guided the work, but practical concerns dictated alterations. Electrical systems were updated, climate control installed, fire safety modernized, and the gardens redesigned to balance historical accuracy with visitor accessibility. These interventions ensured that Biltmore could survive as an attraction, but they also sanitized it, erasing the friction and imperfection that once defined life in such a vast, live-in machine. What the public sees is perfection. What is hidden are the compromises, the continual expense, and the layers of labor still required to maintain the illusion of permanence. Agriculture and forestry, once the lifeblood of the estate's self-sufficiency, were recast as attractions. Visitors today can stroll through working farms, interact with cattle, and see gardens maintained for both show and productivity. Yet the scale has been downsized and the labor behind these operations is largely invisible. What was once survival and livelihood is now curated experience, repurposed to fit an idealized vision of Gilded Age refinement. Staff, who still number in the hundreds, perform roles that echo those of the past, but with far less autonomy or urgency, converting work into spectacle while the original pressures, the seasonal demands, the payroll obligations, the machinery of unrelenting upkeep, remain largely hidden from view. Even interpretation of history has been carefully managed. Narratives focus on Vanderbilt's vision, architectural ingenuity, and landscape artistry, often sidestepping the human cost of construction, the inequalities embedded in design, and the social hierarchies enforced within the house's walls. Signage, guides, and marketing materials emphasize elegance and longevity, while economic and labor realities are quietly minimized. Step past the showpiece rooms and the public corridors, and you can still see echoes of the estate's operational backbone: the service staircases, the basement kitchens, the electrical vaults. These spaces tell a different story, one of the unseen hands and persistent effort that made Biltmore not just a house, but a functioning empire of architecture and landscape. The rebranding also ensured financial survival. Today, Biltmore functions as a hybrid: museum, hotel, agricultural estate, and cultural attraction. Each visitor ticket, each retail purchase, each seasonal event contributes to a system designed to keep the estate alive and visually immaculate. Yet even this modern model cannot entirely erase the original truth. The estate is expensive, labor-intensive, and complex beyond comprehension. Its survival depends on continuous investment, both in physical maintenance and in the careful construction of public perception. In a sense, Biltmore's transition mirrors a broader tension in heritage preservation. The desire to awe and inspire, to communicate wealth and beauty, must coexist with the weight of history's cost. The grandeur remains, the French Renaissance-inspired architecture still commands attention, but the human toil, the financial strain, and the operational rigor that defined the estate for generations have largely been hidden behind glass, velvet ropes, and curated narratives. What the public consumes is a story of elegance and legacy. What remains largely invisible is the machinery, the labor, and the expense that sustain it. The Biltmore Estate stands today as a monument to ambition and excess, a house that became more than a residence, more than a work of architecture, more than a legacy. It became a machine of wealth and power, built on both vision and unseen toil. Its limestone facades rise over the landscape of Asheville, commanding attention, suggesting permanence, but beneath the grandeur lies a web of human labor, financial strain, and social hierarchy that few visitors truly perceive. Step into the Great Hall and you feel the sweep of history, the deliberate orchestration of space and scale, the echoes of footsteps that once moved invisibly through hidden corridors, sustaining the illusion of effortless luxury. Beauty in this context carries a shadow. Every ornate staircase, every gilded balustrade, every meticulously polished floor is the product of thousands of hands, hundreds of workers whose labor is largely invisible, whose daily effort created the backdrop for Vanderbilt's power without a crown. The legacy of the estate is not simply measured in square footage or room count. It is measured in tension, the gap between appearance and reality, between opulence and cost, between ambition and consequence. At its height, Biltmore was a self-contained world. Forests managed for timber revenue, farms producing meat and produce, mechanized systems delivering heat, water, and electricity throughout a sprawling mansion. Every element was designed with precision, yet every system required continuous oversight. Laborers endured back-breaking work, often under harsh conditions, while the family enjoyed the fruits of their control. What they don't show in the glossy brochures or guided tours are the lives organized around that spectacle, the hierarchy enforced through architecture, and the physical and financial burdens borne quietly by those behind the walls. Even as a museum and tourist destination, the estate continues to carry its original contradictions. Visitors marvel at the French Renaissance-inspired chateaux, the sweeping views, the manicured gardens, and the vast art collection, but the narrative has been carefully curated. The inequalities of the Gilded Age, the human cost of construction, the financial fragility hidden behind stone walls, all are softened, omitted, or reinterpreted. Step past the showpiece rooms into service corridors or basement workshops, and traces of the original machinery of luxury remain. Service bells, staff staircases, maintenance rooms. They remind us that grandeur requires invisible scaffolding, that beauty and power are never free, and that what survives in public memory is often a sanitized version of reality. The financial pressures that once threatened to undo the Vanderbilt fortune are still echoed in the ongoing operation of the estate. Maintaining 250 rooms, 43 bathrooms, and nearly 8,000 acres of landscaped gardens is an endeavor that requires hundreds of staff and continuous investment. Electricity, water, climate control, fire safety, and structural preservation demand attention every day. The house that was once a statement of personal control has become a testament to institutional endurance, sustained by tourism, retail, and agriculture, yet still dependent on resources, labor, and careful management. The machinery of luxury persists, even as the original owners are long gone. Biltmore's story is inseparable from the broader history of American wealth, inequality, and ambition. It reflects the extreme concentration of resources in the Gilded Age, the desire to translate financial power into permanence, and the consequences of scale and extravagance. It also forces reflection. Who really paid for this legacy? The wealth may have rested in Vanderbilt hands, but the labor, the time, the physical effort, the hidden costs, and the social hierarchies that underpinned every room and corridor were borne by others, largely unseen. The estate is a work of art, but it is also a historical record, a preserved chronicle of ambition entangled with human cost. Walk the halls, pause at the terraces, look over the managed forests stretching beyond the horizon, and you confront the duality at the heart of Biltmore. The house is exquisite. The landscape is breathtaking. The vision was unparalleled. And yet, every inch of that beauty is built upon a shadowed foundation of labor, inequality, and financial reckoning. The elegance masks but does not erase the moral and economic complexities embedded in the walls, the floors, and the systems that continue to hum quietly beneath the surface. In the end, the Biltmore Estate challenges us to consider the price of grandeur. It asks us to recognize both the genius of its design and the human and financial structures required to sustain it. It is a testament to what wealth, ambition, and architectural mastery can achieve, but it is also a reminder that every masterpiece carries hidden costs, that every statement of power leaves traces beyond the visible, and that history is layered in both stone and shadow. Which house should we investigate next?